According to the great stories of the Bible, King Solomon, son of David, ruled Israel 3,000 years ago. He was renowned for his wisdom, his women, and his astonishing wealth. King Solomon surpassed all the kings on the earth in wealth and wisdom. And when the rich, powerful, and exotic Queen of Sheba visited King Solomon, she brought him gifts from the mystical land of Ophir. And she came to Jerusalem with a very great train, with camels that bear spices, and very much gold. But where was Ophir? Where had all that gold come from? Did it even exist? For thousands of years, ancient Greeks, Renaissance adventurers, Victorian explorers, and modern-day scientists have searched for the source of Solomon's gold. A mysterious place that would famously become known as King Solomon's Mines. This is the story of one man who really believed he had found them. And he did find something, but it was not what he expected. Karl Mauch, the explorer who would become forever linked with the discovery of King Solomon's mines, was a man of humble origins.
Mauch was born in 1837 in Stettin, a small town in Germany. His father was a carpenter and later went to the army, and Mauch had 3 siblings, so the family was not very wealthy, and maybe one could even say that they were poor.
But when he was a child, he received a gift that changed his life forever.
For his 10th birthday present, he received a world atlas, which showed Africa as almost a total blank on the map. And this really inspired Mauch to become an explorer, to fill in the gaps in the map of Africa.
At first, Mauch's interest had nothing to do with King Solomon. He was attracted by the mystery of Africa and the opportunity it presented for an ambitious young boy.
Africa was a good destination for explorers because the interior of Africa was still unknown to Europeans, and so there were still opportunities of heroism and adventure.
As Mauch grew older, his obsession with Africa continued.
During this time, he avidly consumed virtually every book on the geography of Africa from the 16th century onwards, including the accounts in particular of the early Portuguese explorers.
And one story leapt from the page to catch Mauch's eye. In 1531, Vicente Pagado, a captain of a Portuguese garrison on the southern coast of Africa, wrote,
"Among the gold mines of the inland plains between the Limpopo and Zambezi River, there is a fortress built of stones of marvelous size, and there appears to be no mortar joining them."
Pagado and his Portuguese explorers were convinced that this fortress was the palace of the Queen of Sheba, and the gold mines were the source of King Solomon's wealth. The Bible tells us that King Solomon was the son of the great King David, who slew the giant Philistine warrior Goliath. How Solomon became celebrated for his wisdom, his women, and his fabulous wealth. But the Bible also describes Solomon's great meeting with the Queen of Sheba, who brought him tons of gold and spices from her land.
She arrived at Jerusalem with a retinue of camels, laden with spices and other precious objects intended as gifts for Solomon.
And she gave the king 120 talents of gold, and of spices very great store, and precious stones. There came no more such abundance of spices as these which the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. This is the story we all remember, but in reality there is not a shred of evidence that Solomon or the Queen of Sheba ever existed, or that any of this story was actually true.
As early as we can trace our sources, readers of the Bible have been fascinated by the question of where exactly Solomon's wealth comes from. In the 1st century, for example, the Jewish historian Josephus speculated that his wealth came from India. And ever since then, interpreters have been struggling to piece together the clues in the Bible to figure out its exact location. The Bible offers some intriguing clues about the source of Solomon's wealth. It tells us, for example, that Solomon had to dispatch ships in order to retrieve this wealth. Solomon's ships traveled to a place called Ophir, and also mention a place called Tarshish.
For the king had at sea the navy of Tarshish with the navy of Hiram. Once in 3 years the navy of Tarshish bringing in gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks.
No one knows the exact meaning of the words Ophir and Tarshish. Ophir is often associated with gold. Tarshish, some scholars believe, actually refers to a kind of ship meant for traveling long distances. The location of these places is unknown.
But Mauk had discovered an important clue. Vicente Pagado, the Portuguese captain who described the fortress of marvelous size, was based in Sofala on the southern coast of Africa.
The Europeans who were looking for Solomon's wealth were not usually reading the Hebrew Bible. They were usually reading the Greek or Latin translation of the Bible. And in the Greek translation of the Bible, the word Ophir actually has an S appearing at the beginning of the word, spelling Sophir. So when the Portuguese arrived on the coast of Africa at a port town called Sofala, they made a linguistic connection between the name of that port town and the Greek biblical word for Ophir or Sophir, believing that to be evidence that they had found the source of Solomon's wealth.
So could Sofala be Ophir? Mauk started digging for further evidence. And again, it was the Portuguese accounts that provided more clues.
A Portuguese sailor by the name of Thomas Lopez arrived at the port town of Sofala in southern Africa in 1502. And there he was greeted by Muslims who told him of native sources that described something very curious. They described how ships belonging to Solomon would arrive once every 3 years and extract from a nearby town a tremendous amount of gold.
And they went with the servants of Solomon to Ophir, and took thence 450 talents of gold, which they delivered to King Solomon. They had the right name. Sofala was Ophir, and they seem to have found the gold. So if the Portuguese were right, they may have stumbled upon one of the most amazing finds ever. Mauk was certain he had cracked it. King Solomon's wealth was in southern Africa, and he was determined to find it. But he realized that he was woefully underqualified. So for the next 11 years, he devoted his entire life to getting ready for his Africa expedition. Every day he prepared himself both mentally and physically for the day when he would realize his dream.
Mauk was always good in school, and he was interested in natural science and would have liked to go to university, but his parents lacked the financial means.
To pay for his expedition, he trained as a teacher and became a private tutor in Austria.
Mauk must have been really determined to go to Africa. In all these years, he didn't have support, he didn't have any money, but he still continued with his plans.
He taught himself English, French, and Arabic.
He tried to acquire specialist knowledge through reading specialist books and magazines like Petermann's Geographical News.
In his spare time, he studied Latin, medicine, and astronomy.
He visited the Botanical Garden and the Natural History Museum in Graz, where he was working at that time as a teacher.
There, he gained some knowledge in botany, geology, and natural history.
He built his own collections of minerals and insects.
In 1863, Mauk was convinced he was ready. So he wrote to August Petermann, the editor of Germany's highly respected geographical magazine. His aim was to sell himself as an explorer worth investing in.
I believe intellectually, and considering my modest means, I have done all that could be done. But the body too requires preparation for such enterprises. By walking 6 miles or more each day, in every season, over any ground, often without any food or drink till my return to the point of departure, and always wearing the same warm clothes, I have tried to steel my body. Apart from this, I have not neglected gymnastics and musketry. In stature, I am tall and heavily built, and I am in excellent health. Considering these facts, I believe that I am capable of taking part in an expedition on these lines.
Experience the past like never before with History Hit's award-winning original documentaries and ad-free podcasts with our expert historians like Dan Snow, Susanna Lipscomb, Lucy Worsley, Mary Beard, Tristan Hughes, and myself, Matt Lewis. Sign up for an exclusive discount using the link in the description and embark on your historical journey from the wonders of ancient Egypt and the life of Anne Boleyn to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and the discovery of Shackleton's endurance. Get history wherever, whenever, exclusively on History Hit.
Mauch's letter received an immediate reply from the magazine's editor.
Petermann's response was negative and rather discouraging. He explained to Mauch how difficult and strenuous such an exploration would be. But he proposed that if Mauch should actually manage to get to Africa, he would consider publishing letters or reports.
Despite Petermann's rejection, at the age of 26, after 11 years of preparation, Mauch was ready to go.
But Mauch decided to spend a few months researching in London before he actually went to South Africa. And by the end of that time, he'd actually run out of money.
Mauch worked as a deckhand on a steamship to fund himself before arriving in Durban, South Africa in January 1865. His quest could now begin. With only the barest of necessities, a small pocket compass, hunting knife, blanket, painting equipment and handgun, Mauch set out to explore southern Africa in pursuit of the land of Ophir in June 1865.
I have tried to acclimatize myself by walking diligently around the country, unconcerned if I roam across unknown countryside for 2 to 3 days without food, or even if I should have an unpleasant encounter with the largest carnivores.
But Mauch soon ran into trouble.
Mauch's travels were not at all straightforward. He went through a great deal of suffering, almost to the point of starvation.
This was the 5th day of hunger for me, and it can be understood that I contemplated the future with a jaundiced view. Even small birds seemed to fly away from me, while I am still miles away from them. No pheasant nor partridge was to be seen. And an hour-long effort to try to catch fish also failed. Hungry, thirsty, tired, with almost insupportable pain in my knee, I still had to cover 25 miles, and bad luck would have it that I didn't get a chance for a final shot, and thus did not get anything to eat.
In desperation, Mauch sent a messenger with a letter to August Petermann, the editor of Germany's geographical magazine, to support his African expedition. This time his luck was in. Petermann appealed to his readers to support Mauch.
We believed that he had to be helped. He is the only able explorer in the whole of South Africa at the moment. It would appear as a patriotic and scientific duty to support Herr Mauch and not leave him helpless in the far-off interior.
Petermann's appeal for support for Mauch in his magazine was successful. Several of his readers donated small sums. As Mauch didn't have any money himself, it was really helpful for him, but in comparison to other explorers, it was still a very small sum.
However, these donations did help Mauch continue his exploration of southern Africa for the next 8 years. Two years into his journey, Mauch entered the Tati region, an area located on the borders of Botswana and Zimbabwe. And with the help of the famous British hunter Henry Hartley, Mauch made his first significant discovery.
On the 27th of July, 1867, Hartley brought me the news that, when following a wounded elephant, he passed several pits dug into quartz. I came to a site which I recognized as a smelting place. On examining some recent stones, I found gold. Highly pleased, I ran back to the camp to impart the good news.
When Mauch discovered the first gold field, he was really delighted that he had made such a big and great discovery.
The following day, Mauch discovered another gold field. Could these be the mines of King Solomon? Word of the gold mine spread like wildfire across the southern African plains, prompting one of its earliest gold rushes. As newspapers headlined his great discovery, Germany's geographical magazine believed Mauch was onto something much bigger.
Concerning the gold fields discovered by Mauch, it is not improbable that they are identical with the Ophir of the Bible and with the places from which Solomon obtained his wealth in gold.
But if finding gold mines was encouraging, for Mauch to be really sure that he was in the land of Ophir, he had to find the city worthy of the great Queen of Sheba. In the same year that Mauch discovered the goldfields of Tati, he began to hear rumors of an abandoned city with huge stone walls described by locals as fabulous buildings. Mauch was told that the city lay in the mountainous country between the two largest rivers in southern Africa, the Zambezi and the Limpopo. In May 1871, Mauch wrote confidently to his country's geographical magazine to tell them he wanted to dedicate his next expedition to the newly united German people.
I shall make it the highest duty in my profession to add honor to the name of the German nation. I expect that my next journey will offer such opportunity. The discovery of the ruins of Ophir would be a point which would be envied by other nations.
For the next 3 years, Mauch searched for the ruins. He shot elephant and rabbit for food, and suffered great hunger and exhaustion.
Mauch tried to get to the ruins for a long period and often failed and had to come back to the European settlements.
Mauch survived robberies and attempted to win the trust of local tribes.
Throughout his travels, he had to form alliances with the tribal rulers.
He feared the native people around him. He thought that they might even kill him.
And was at one time held prisoner in Matabele land until he came to an arrangement for his release.
But eventually, local Karanga tribesmen brought him face to face with the magnificent walled city.
Finally, on the 5th of September 1871, I was lucky enough to be the first white man to set eyes on them. The ruins represent a mighty fortress, consisting of two parts, of which one, on a mountain of about 400 feet with very large boulders, is separated by a narrow little valley from the second, which stands on a slight rise.
Malk just couldn't believe his eyes. Nothing like it had been seen south of the equator, and it just shouldn't have been there.
Malk was convinced that he had finally found the ruins of the Queen of Sheba's palace. But how could he be sure? Malk set about examining the structure of the ruins and found that the walls were built of stone without any mortar. This matched exactly with Vicente Pigado's 16th century description of the ruins he had read as a teenager.
Among the gold mines of the inland plains between the Limpopo and Zambezi River, there is a fortress built of stones of marvelous size, and there appears to be no mortar joining them.
Malk's next step was to work out who had created it.
He couldn't believe that such a structure could have been built by native Africans.
Malk's view was supported by the local tribesmen.
I have learned from the local inhabitants that they themselves have lived here for only 40 years and that the region was quite uninhabited before that time. All are absolutely convinced that white people once inhabited the region, for even now there are signs of habitations and iron tools which could not have been produced by blacks.
So if the palace was built by white people, where did they come from? Malk turned to the Bible for clues. There is no description of Ophir in the Bible, but there is a description of the building of King Solomon's legendary temple. And the king commanded, and they brought great stones, costly stones, and huge stones to lay the foundation of the house.
As he looked at the structures that comprise the Great Zimbabwe, he noticed a resemblance to the Temple of Solomon as it's described in the Bible, and to other structures that archaeologists were only then beginning to learn about.
Malk considered it likely that the palace was built by an ancient people called the Phoenicians. In the 1850s and 60s, archaeologists began to excavate colonies that the Phoenicians had established throughout the Mediterranean, and also sites in their homeland of Phoenicia, in what is now Lebanon.
And this revealed to Europeans this complex, vast, far-reaching civilization that predated the Greeks and Romans, that had spread throughout the Mediterranean, and had an impact on culture reaching from the Middle East to North Africa. And this really, really inspired the imagination of many Europeans who began to believe that the Phoenicians were capable of traveling great distances.
The Phoenicians built their structures without mortar, and there was no mortar at this site. But this in itself wasn't proof. What else may there be to link it to the Phoenicians? Again, the Bible offered a clue. It made it clear that cedar wood was a critical ingredient at the time. And it was covered with cedar above upon the beams. Cedar was a wood famously found in modern-day Lebanon. The obvious place to look for the wood was where it supported the stone structure.
Malk didn't really have the materials or the manpower required for a major exploration of the site, but he did take some samples of the wood.
I cut some splinters off the crossbeam over the northern entrance. The wood is still quite healthy, of reddish color. A comparison of it with the wood of my pencil shows great similarity, and therefore, I suppose, strengthened by further hypotheses, that it must be cedar wood.
Convinced that the cedar trees didn't exist on the lower Zambezi, Malk was sure that it must have been brought there by Solomon's Phoenician builders from Lebanon. As the Bible says, "Now therefore command thou that they hew me cedar trees out of Lebanon." Suddenly, it all came together for Malk. Here was a city that no African could have built. It was constructed by Phoenicians in the same style as King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. The Phoenicians used stone without mortar and brought cedar wood from Lebanon to make the supporting beams. And the local name for Sofala is Sophia, like Ophir in the Bible. And to top it all, Malk had also discovered the 2 gold mines, the source of Solomon's wealth. So surely this was it.
I believe that I do not err when I suppose that the ruin on the mountain is an imitation of the Solomonic temple on Mount Moriah. The ruin on the plain, a copy of that palace in which the Queen of Sheba dwelled during her visit to Solomon. Besides, they conform best with the well-known Phoenician buildings. Natives and Arabs would have built differently. Even the fact that I could not find a trace of inscriptions anywhere appears to me to confirm the justification of my opinion. For nowhere do we read that Solomon had an inscription of any kind fixed to his temple. I believe Ophir is the present Sofla or Sofara, by which name it is known and pronounced in the interior.
For Malk, there could be no doubt. Ophir was not in the Middle East. It was here in southern Africa all the time. Malk's longtime supporter, August Petermann, still waiting for further details from Malk, quickly published a brief report on his great discovery.
It is already known from newspaper reports that on the 5th of September 1871, Karl Mauch discovered the magnificent ruins in the mountainous country between the Limpopo and the Zambezi, about 40 miles inland from Sofala, of which the old Portuguese reports tell, and which were connected with King Solomon's Ophir expeditions in early times.
Malk's great discovery made a huge impact around the world, and in particular inspired the great British novelist H. Rider Haggard to write his famous book, King Solomon's Mines.
H. Rider Haggard's King Solomon's Mines was the most successful adventure novel of the 19th century.
Haggard tells the tale of one man's quest into the heart of Africa to discover the legendary King Solomon's Mines.
And he went on to tell me how he had found in the far interior a ruined city, which he believed to be the Ophir of the Bible. when suddenly he said to me, "Lad, did you ever hear of the Suleiman Mountains up to the northwest of the Mushkalumbi country?" I told him I never had. "Oh well," he said, "that is where Solomon really had his mines."
Overnight, the book's title, King Solomon's Mines, a phrase no one had ever used before, entered into popular legend.
And that novel was widely read by people in Europe, and it incited their curiosity and motivated other would-be explorers to travel to Africa in search of the gold and wealth that they believed they could find there.
Rider Haggard became one of the richest and most successful novelists ever, thanks to Mauch's discovery. The one person who got very little out of it, however, was Mauch himself.
When Mauch came back to Germany, he hoped that he would be rewarded with a position at a natural history museum. But I think the lacking university degree and maybe even his personality were aspects which made it difficult for him.
Impoverished and sick, Mauch was forced to take work in a cement factory.
He suffered dreadfully from depression. He had a liver disease as a result of his African travels. His body was racked with pain continually.
And as his neighbor said, he was often drunk because his medicine didn't work anymore, so he was drinking alcohol instead.
He spent his last days in a hotel above a railway station near Stuttgart, sleeping on the 3rd floor. He slept in an armchair next to an open window, and one night fell from the window.
His neighbor found him just in the early morning and brought him to the hospital in Stuttgart. His spine was broken and both his legs were paralyzed.
37-year-old Karl Mauch died in hospital a few days later on the 4th of April 1875. It is uncertain whether his death was accidental or self-inflicted. With his death, so died his reputation. His writings were largely ignored by the academic world.
Mauch's discoveries went virtually unrecognized at the time. They were published in a mere 52 pages in August Petermann's journals, and if you couldn't read German, you would never have noticed them. And it wasn't until 1960 that his journals were actually published in full form.
But at least thanks to Mauch, King Solomon's mines seem to have been discovered. And for many years, people believed that the ruin in southern Africa was the site. But at the start of the 20th century, even this legacy was challenged. Now a new generation of explorers emerged, and they were very different. Gone were the days of romance and biblical literalism. This was a time for archaeology and science.
Biblical archaeology really started in the mid-1800s when we had mostly theologians, religious figures, going out and trying to confirm people and places and events in the Bible. As time went on, these early geographers and theologians are replaced by professional archaeologists.
One of these new professionals was British-born David Randall McIver, famous for his scientific approach to archaeology. In 1905, 3,000 years after King Solomon's reign, Randall McIver made 7 carefully detailed examinations of Karl Mauch's Ophir. The first thing he did was to date the buildings. By examining the pottery unearthed in the dig, he was able to tell when they were made, and Randall McIver quickly learnt something revealing. They are unquestionably African in every detail and belong to a period which is fixed by foreign imports as, in general, medieval. In other words, one of the key foundations of Mauch's Ophir theory was wrong.
David Randall McIver was the first person to identify a medieval date. And dating was really important because all of the foreign origins thesis, going right back to Karl Marx and his sort of biblical interpretation, depended on Great Zimbabwe being a lot older than it was, thousands of years older.
The Great Zimbabwe ruins were not built by an ancient and vanished white civilization as was currently believed, but were of purely African origin and that they dated from about the 14th century. A second of his key findings would also be challenged. Mauch was convinced that the structures had been built by Phoenicians with wood and stone brought from Lebanon. Randall McIver assessed and dismissed his interpretations as incredulous and found no such evidence whatsoever.
David Randall McIver said, look, everything I've found here is identical to local African materials, remains, and so on. And he just said, well, that clearly means it must be African. There is no sort of layer underneath.
The style of the buildings cannot be proved to owe anything to foreign influences. All characteristics of Oriental and European architecture are entirely absent. Following in Randall McIver's footsteps, the formidable British archaeologist Gertrude Caton Thompson led the first all-female excavation of the ruins in 1929. And made the next assault on Mauch's theory of Ophir.
Gertrude Caton Thompson was sent over by the British Association in order to kind of provide a final answer.
Caton Thompson dug deeper in scale than anybody else before her. She sunk 6 trenches into the ground around the main buildings and excavated in areas undisturbed by previous visitors. When she had finished dating the site, she declared,
"Examination of all the existing evidence, gathered from every quarter, still can produce not one single item that is not in accordance with the claim of a medieval date. If by indigenous we mean an origin born of the country on which they stand, then the ruins are, in my opinion, indigenous in a full sense of the term."
In the early days of archaeology, claims by amateurs, by explorers, could stand for decades before somebody would actually come in and test what they had said and either prove or disprove. So it was a matter of 30 or 40 years before the archaeologist came in and really started excavating and said, yes, this is connected with King Solomon's mines, or no, it isn't. And in the case of that city, the answer was no, it's not. Your claim is wrong.
So everything Mauch had said about the ruins was wrong, even down to the piece of wood he had taken from one of the supporting beams. It had not come from the cedar trees in Lebanon, but was in fact a local African sandalwood.
Mauch's scientific techniques were much more primitive than those used today. So for example, to identify the wood that was used in the structures he found at the Great Zimbabwe, he didn't rely on some elaborate chemical analysis. Instead, he simply looked at the wood and compared it to the wood he was using in his own pencil.
And of course there was another factor. Mauch was a product of the Victorian age, which had very different views on Black Africa.
Mauch was convinced that Great Zimbabwe must have been built by white builders, and the idea that it could have been built by an African people didn't come to his mind, which goes along with the European thinking at that time that the African indigenous population was a naturalistic, uncivilized people without a history and without a civilized culture. So believing that Great Zimbabwe might have been built by an African people would have meant a contradiction to this firmly established view.
So does all this mean that Karl Mauch's quest turned out to be worthless? In a strange sort of way, no. Because while Mauch's conclusions were ridiculed, his discovery of the ancient city in 1871 has turned out to be one of the most important archaeological finds in all of Africa. Known today as Great Zimbabwe or Great House of Stones, these ancient ruins have become one of Africa's most prized national monuments and a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Great Zimbabwe is representative of African achievement, brilliant African achievement in the medieval period.
Archaeological evidence suggests that Great Zimbabwe was built between the 12th and 15th centuries by ancestors of the Shona people who had settled in the region nearly 1,000 years before and who still inhabit Zimbabwe today. From a peasant village, it grew into a very prosperous political and commercial kingdom from 1150 to 1450, with a population of more than 10,000. Its development and growth was centered on agriculture, mainly cattle, and its massive gold and ivory trade went as far as Arabia and China.
They found Ming pottery there, they found Arabic pottery there, Indian beads and so on. So clearly it was part of a much larger trade system. And to conjure up that kind of trade position and to be able to build such a large site and so such a sophisticated site, it must have been controlling all sorts of agricultural resources.
No one is certain why Great Zimbabwe went into decline and was left abandoned in the 15th century, but many suspect it was due to the collapse of trade, political instability and famine.
Now the whole world can recognize that Great Zimbabwe is a fantastic place, an amazing achievement. Structurally it's an amazing, a beautiful place, beautifully built and so on, but also it's representative of a very sophisticated African culture taking place. Its significance is probably, in its shortest, summed up by the fact that the name of the country derives from it. There are not many countries that derive their name from an archaeological site, and it's well deserved.
If Karl Malk had realized this at the time of his discovery in 1871, he really could have changed the way the world viewed African civilizations. But of course there is another question. Does all this mean that the story of King Solomon's mines is simply a legend with no real basis in history at all?
The Bible doesn't actually mention King Solomon's mines. It mentions the wealth of Solomon, along with wisdom and women, the 3 W's. But it doesn't say where his wealth actually came from. So it's all made up by H. Rider Haggard in his novel, King Solomon's Mines. And as archaeologists, we can't be driven by a novel written in the last 100 years to dictate what we're looking for.
In the 100 years after Malk's death, nothing was found to substantiate the belief that King Solomon or his great wealth ever existed. But recently, little by little, modern scientific archaeologists are finding some evidence. And one of the most exciting discoveries of recent times was the evidence of Solomon's father's existence, King David.
In the early 1990s, 93, 94, there was an inscription found at a site in the north of Israel, Tel Dan. It was from an ancient inscription dating to about the middle of the 9th century BC.
The inscribed stone contained the letters Beit David and are identical to the Hebrew and early Aramaic words for House of David. And these words are believed by many archaeologists to be an authentic reference to the Bible.
It said that a king from the house of David had done such and such, Beit David, the house of David. And that's the first mention of either David or the house of David that's ever been found. If we were talking in, say, even the late 1980s, I would have said that there is no evidence whatsoever for either David and Solomon outside the Bible. When the inscription at Tel Dan was found, then that put the debate to rest. It was clear that David did exist. And I really do think it's just a matter of time before there is something attesting to the reign of Solomon.
And that time may not be too far away. In an arid region in modern-day Jordan, south of the Dead Sea, archaeologists believe they may have found mines created around the time of King Solomon in 1000 BC.
We found hundreds of ancient mines. We found metal production sites, and we decided, just based on the surface remains, that we would start to do an intensive excavation at one of these sites, Khirbat al-Nahas, which in Arabic means the ruins of copper.
Assuming that King Solomon did have mines, one of the things we have to ask is, what kind of mines are they? Are they gold mines? Are they copper mines? I would actually argue they're more likely to be copper mines than that he's making his money from the buying and selling of copper.
Copper may not be gold, but during the Bronze Age it was an essential element in the manufacture of tools and weapons, so it was incredibly valuable.
What we discovered was that at Khirbat al-Nahas, there were two major centuries of copper production on an industrial scale, and that was in the 10th century BC and the 9th century BC.
That is the time of Solomon. So some have been wondering whether we've got King Solomon's mines here.
We haven't found Solomon's mines, but I think our results put the issue of Solomon's mines, or let's say the Solomonic kingdom and its reach, back on the table.
So far, the ancient Greeks, Renaissance adventurers and Victorian explorers have all tried and failed to find King Solomon's mines. Now the search continues into the 21st century. And maybe the archaeologists in Jordan will discover the source of Solomon's great wealth. Only time will tell. But of course, even if they do, there is so far nothing to suggest his wealth has anything to do with someone called the Queen of Sheba. The evidence for her remains entirely elusive.
In Rome, deep in the heart of the Vatican, they say there is an amazing object.
It becomes one of the real marvels of the city and one of the chief things that a pilgrim would go and see and venerate.
Not a painting or icon, but a true image of Jesus Christ. It is called the Veil of Veronica.
The Veronica was believed to be a piece of fabric that touched the face of Christ and then bore a miraculous image.
Venerated for over 1,000 years, this was once the most prized relic in Christendom and an object of pilgrimage. But one man has a shocking revelation. He believes the object in the Vatican is a fake. And he knows because he's found the real one. This is the story of Paul Badder's journey of discovery to find what had happened to the true face of God.
Confessing that this face has gone lost, it was a hard thing to do.
If he is right, his discovery could have huge implications for the history of the Church and for the future of Christianity itself.
It was the first time for around 500 years that the Pope saw and venerated the true face of Christ.
The story began at a dinner in Turin, when journalist and author Paul Bader met German art historian Professor Heinrich Pfeiffer. Father Pfeiffer told Paul an amazing tale that, if true, could rewrite history, be the most significant discovery in Christianity, and show how what was once one of the most venerated objects in the Vatican could be a fraud.
I raised my glass to him and thought he must have been crazy.
The story revolved around a fabulous relic, the Veil of Veronica, whose origins are immortalized in most churches as the so-called sixth station of the cross. The stations of the cross take us through Christ's last terrible journey to his execution.
Every church has these images that we call the Stations of the Cross, and that allows us to accompany Jesus as he makes his way from his condemnation to death by Pontius Pilate right up to the moment of crucifixion and his burial.
Step by step, the stations tell the tale of the horrific suffering Jesus faced in the lead-up to his death.
He was scourged and crowned with thorns before he carried the cross through the narrow streets of Jerusalem.
Along the way, Jesus is met by friends and supporters who share in his pain and suffering. One of them was said to be a woman known as Veronica.
A pious woman of Jerusalem saw Christ suffering and bleeding and sweating, and she took her sweat cloth, which was a cloth she was wearing around her head, and gave it to him to dry his face from blood and sweat.
The legend has it that when Christ handed the cloth back to her, miraculously, an image of his face had transferred to the material. But it is only a story. Veronica herself is not actually mentioned in the Bible.
The legend of Veronica is moving us because it is a legend of compassion and love and a miracle. And it allows us to have an image of Christ.
Whatever its actual origin, stories of a cloth bearing a miraculous image of Christ, not made by human hands, continue to circulate throughout the early Christian period.
There's a whole interconnected network of legends about a miraculous image of Jesus' face, which seem to come from different sources and have different motivations behind them.
Somehow, this miraculous cloth with its image of Christ made its way to Rome.
The first documented evidence of the Veronica being in Rome is from 705, when Pope John VII built a shrine for the Veronica.
By 1200, the Veronica was on permanent display in St. Peter's Basilica, and thousands of people flocked to see it. This image became hugely important to the world of art. Until then, artists had no idea of what Jesus actually looked like. There are no clues in the Gospels, so they depicted him in an idealistic or general way.
There are images of Jesus in the catacombs and elsewhere from the 2nd and 3rd centuries where Jesus just looks like a normal young Roman man, clean-shaven, a bit plump. You can only identify him by the fact that he's performing a miracle. And he's normally doing it in the way that a Roman god would do. So, for example, he's curing someone by touching them with a stick.
But when the Veronica appeared, all that changed. Now, artists and worshippers could look at an actual image of a real face.
It was very visual, and especially in the Middle Ages, the visual side of the faith was tremendously important. Having this imprint of Christ's face was almost as good as having a photograph.
You had an idea how God, who became man, really looks. God was not an idea, It was a face. God got a face, a human face.
This same face was seen and copied by many of the great artists and appeared in more and more works. It became the model for Jesus. The characteristics are always the same: the parted hair, the thin beard, the nose and mouth.
The Veronica was copied widely, and the simplified image of Christ's face was distributed across the world.
In fact, this image became so popular that a whole guild of specialist artists was created just to meet the demand.
From the middle of the 14th century, you get really clear evidence for people who are reproducing the Veronica and reproducing the holy images of Rome and selling those on as copies, but copies which bear the same spiritual authority and miracle-working power that the original did.
The Veronica proved not only a potent symbol, but also a great source of revenue as an object of pilgrimage.
The Veronica becomes a very important relic in Rome, that there's a chapel dedicated to it in St. Peter's. It soon becomes even the symbol of pilgrimage to Rome. So it becomes one of the real marvels of the city and one of the chief things that a pilgrim would go and see and venerate.
Successive popes used the Veronica to increase their prestige and influence.
Innocent III is particularly interested in promoting the Veronica, in part to promote the city of Rome itself and to encourage the pilgrimage to Rome.
Pope Innocent III granted indulgences for those who prayed before the Veronica, gave it its own feast day, and even promenaded it around the city.
The highlight of the Holy Year was the showing of the Veronica, because this was the encounter with Christ on earth when we were still alive.
Eventually, the Veronica became big business. Numbers visiting Rome became so vast that the decision was made to tear down the old Basilica of St. Peter's and rebuild it.
One of the ways in which popes of the early Renaissance proclaimed their authority and created their legacy was through major building projects. And St. Peter's is a good example of a Renaissance pope crafting his legacy with an oversized building project.
Dominating the center of this magnificent new basilica is the altar, which according to tradition was built above the tomb of St. Peter.
And then around it, they have these 4 pillars where they place the relics which were so popular in the Middle Ages: the head of St. Andrew, the Veil of Veronica, the Holy Lance, and also part of the True Cross. And each of these relics, in a sense, being a cornerstone, a pillar of this new Basilica of St. Peter's, the heart of the church.
In other words, the Veronica had become one of the great pillars of the Catholic Church. But then Rome entered a dark period of disruption and violence, and everything changed. On the 6th of May, 1527, Rome was looted and attacked, ironically, by the troops of the Holy Roman Emperor.
The sack of Rome was a catastrophe for the Roman Church. For 1,000 years, Rome was a safe place, where all the pilgrims and the kings and the emperors who came to Rome left important donations at St. Peter.
In an orgy of violence, 500 men were slain in front of the altar, and many of the relics it had housed disappeared.
According to the contemporary reports, the most important relics were given away in a pub, and drinking soldiers were drying their mouth with the Veil of Veronica.
In time, the dust settled, and the new St. Peter's Basilica was finally completed and consecrated. But by then, something had obviously changed. Although the Vatican still claimed to have the Veronica safe, It was no longer on public display, and on the rare occasions when it was shown, it seemed to look different.
Suddenly the Veronica was not a clear, shiny image anymore, but a dark cloth with some traces of blood.
It led some to wonder if the original face of God had been lost.
So the big question is, what happened to the original Veronica, the beautiful Veronica, which was painted by the painters in the Middle Ages? It disappeared. And here we have the discovery of Father Pfeiffer.
At the dinner in Turin, Father Pfeiffer outlined his theory to Paul Bader, that the real face of God was no longer in the Vatican. Paul was skeptical. He had been warned of Pfeiffer's fantastical claims before. But Father Pfeiffer went further, claiming he knew where the real Veronica was now. 120 miles away, in a small town called Manapello.
He said, yes, there is something quite unknown on a little remote hilltop in the Abruzzi Mountains. He said, how come the whole world doesn't know of it? He said, yeah, that's a mystery. And, he made it even more mysterious. And so it was just completely unbelievable.
Paul dismissed the whole theory.
I thought it's a fine story, but that was it. I wasn't even curious about it.
But this chance meeting would prove to be a turning point in Paul's life. Some months later, whilst traveling with his daughter down the Adriatic coast, Paul found himself near Manapello, and the church that Father Pfeiffer had claimed was the home to the real Veronica.
Then we got there and I thought it was about lunchtime, so maybe we could have a little lunch up there and have a look at it.
The town of Manapello, nestled within the mountainous region of Abruzzo, is in a remote area, off the beaten track, and largely forgotten by the outside world.
We got off the highway, the restaurant was closed, and I got here to the church.
Walking into the church, Paul saw the image for the first time.
The church had a mass, and after the mass I got up there, and this image was just, he looked at me.
Paul was immediately struck by the eyes, the gaze of Christ on this transparent image.
Seeing somebody's face is really seeing the person. Looking into somebody's eyes, looking at their expression, we can learn so much about that person. We believe that God became man in Jesus Christ, and to be able to see that face as it existed in his humanity, it would be a wonderful link with the divine nature.
Paul noticed that the material was so fine that in certain light, the image almost vanished, only returning when illuminated by a torch.
It is constantly exposed, and you can walk nearby, you can walk around, you can take pictures from any direction, and you can see how the light from the many windows in the church go through it. You can put your hand behind it, you can see your hand. You can put a newspaper behind it, and you can read the newspapers because it is so thin and so fine. And when you get very close to it, you see that the image itself is translucent. You don't see any color.
Paul could have gazed at the image forever, but was pressed for time.
My daughter, she was very impatient. She said, let's get off, I'm hungry, let's have something to eat. So she dragged me away, but I had to look at it one more time. And then he looked at me as if somebody who would just be awakening.
Deeply affected, but not sure of what he'd just seen, Paul couldn't bring himself to believe it was the real thing. And after leaving, put it to one side. Two years passed, and after working abroad as the Jerusalem correspondent for the German daily newspaper Die Welt, Paul returned to Rome. It was here that the Veronica reappeared in his life once again.
Saw around the corner, I saw a little poster announcing, not a press conference, a lecture of a certain Pater Pfeiffer. That's my Pater Pfeiffer. So I have to see him. I have to see him again. I have to see what he's going to tell me about the image.
Father Heinrich Pfeiffer is a German Jesuit scholar specializing in medieval religious art.
Father Pfeiffer is one of the leading art historians of the Christian world, a highly educated man and very important art historian.
During the course of the lecture, Father Pfeiffer reiterated his claim that the Manipello image is the Veil of Veronica. During the talk, Paul was struck by the detail in the magnified close-ups. Seeing them brought a sudden revelation. It was real, and he believed in it.
And I thought, this is it. It must be, everything must be true. But these images, there's no comparison to it. I hadn't seen photos like this before.
He was so fascinating, but it became the mission of his life to spread the message of the human image of God around the world.
Paul was desperate to tell the world about these miraculous images and write a book, but he knew how hard it would be to convince people. It was a formidable challenge. He would need a lot of evidence to win over skeptics. The first question is, how can there even be a face displayed in Manipello if there is already a Veil of Veronica in the Vatican?
Every year on Passion Sunday at 5 p.m, you can see what today is venerated in St. Peter as the Veronica, because the canons of St. Peter's appear on the balcony and bless the faithful with the modern-day Veronica, which is in a huge, heavy silver frame. But you can't see a human face.
Drawing on all his Roman contacts, he tried to secure a meeting with the Vatican authorities. Eventually, in summer of 2004, after much persistence, he was granted an audience with Professor Arnold Nesselrath.
He's a director of the Vatican Museums. He's a very prestigious position. He's a high respected person in the world of art.
Keen to learn the Vatican's angle on the Manipello image, Paul met with Professor Nesselrath. He eagerly showed him pictures of the Manipello face. And questioned the professor about what it could be. But Professor Nesselrath would not be drawn into the debate about the Manipello image.
He had heard something of it, and he had heard something of Pater Pfeiffer. And he was from the big front who had decided about Pater Pfeiffer that he's not to be taken serious.
Professor Nesselrath would neither lend any credence to the Manipello image, nor let Paul see the Vatican's Veronica. When pressed to go and examine the image in Manipello for himself, the professor declined, claiming it was beyond his jurisdiction. The official channels had got him nowhere, he needed a different approach for his investigation. If he can't see the Vatican's image, he needed to find out more about the one in Manopello. When had it arrived, and how had it got there?
The problem with something like the image of Manopello is that there just isn't a paper trail, basically. So we know this object has been here in Manopello for a certain amount of time. We know that it arrived there under certain circumstances, but before that, who knows, basically. There's just no way of telling.
Paul realized that if it is real, then the most likely time for its arrival in Manopello would have been around 1527, during the sack of Rome. And there seemed to be a link. Paul's research showed that Pope Clement took refuge in the Castle Sant'Angelo after the sack of Rome. Something as valuable as the Veronica wouldn't have been left behind. Whilst waiting for the looting to end, Paul thought it possible that the commander of the castle had it spirited away to safety, far from Rome. Intriguingly, the commander had an estate in Manopello, and it all seemed to make sense.
One very realistic perspective is what Bade believes in, that the Castello Sant'Angeli, who had land in Manopello, safeguarded it and brought it there to protect it.
But confusingly, there is another version of events.
In 1506, a stranger appeared in Manopello and gave it to a local. And this local wanted to ask questions, but suddenly the stranger disappeared and he believed he was an angel.
This didn't add up, as 1506 is 21 years before the sack of Rome. Paul then looked at what was happening in Rome during this period and discovered very little was written about the Veronica for 100 years after the sack of Rome, until the consecration of St. Peter's Basilica in 1626. Officially, the Veronica was still there, housed within one of the 4 famous pillars. But Paul discovered something puzzling. In 1629, Pope Urban VIII stopped the veil being displayed. The lucrative trade in copies was prohibited, and he demanded all existing copies be destroyed on pain of excommunication. It was as if someone was trying to hide something.
It was important to recall all the images of the Veronica which has disappeared, and to wait until it disappears from the memory of pilgrims and Christian faithful.
Paul discovered that the story of an angel bringing the image to Manopello first appeared during the time the images were being destroyed. When the Manopello image was scrutinized, 12 townspeople came up with the story that their face of God was brought to them by an angel long before the sack of Rome. To Paul, now this story made sense. The villagers had used this tale to pretend their image couldn't possibly be of the real Veronica, and by doing so, had protected their image from destruction.
It was to disguise something. And then they invented a story, that an angel has brought it here, what you can do easily in Italy, because Italy is full of saints. Miracles are not strange to Italians.
Only after time had passed did the Vatican start showing the Veronica again. But it seemed different and much darker.
The replacement was not a good or bad copy, but something completely different. You had to destroy the original images and replace them by what you have. Later, the Vatican gave out new prints of the Veronica, which resembled what they have today. But this is a clear indication but the original relic disappeared and was exchanged.
The evidence for this can be found in art. Now, not only did it look completely different, so did the copies made by artists. It all seemed to suggest that the original had been lost. Paul was now certain that the original couldn't be in the Vatican, and that at some point the image was exchanged and a new one put in its place. But to prove that, he needed more evidence. He looked at early descriptions of the veil. In the past, it was recorded as being almost transparent. Even the Protestant reformer Martin Luther said it was like a translucent piece of linen. Unlike the blackened image in the Vatican, the Manopello image fitted that description.
There are many compelling reasons to think that that might be the case. The fact that the veil is transparent, that we can see through it, and we knew that was the case for the medieval Veronica.
Paul's attempts to see the Vatican's Veronica continued to be rebuffed. Thinking laterally, he decided to visit their vast treasury museum. He was looking for any evidence that would tie the Manopello image to Rome before 1527.
In the treasury of St. Peter's, there is a broken frame in which the Veronica was once kept. A frame that you could observe from both sides, just like in Manopello, and roughly the same dimensions.
For Paul, it was another clue. Only a transparent image that could be viewed from both sides would ever be displayed in this way.
To have a frame which is translucent only makes sense if you have a translucent cloth, like the Veil of Manopello. The dimensions fit. And this is why we believe that the original Veronica, which was venerated in this frame, is what we today call the Veil of Manopello.
If the true Veronica was still in the Vatican, why had this frame been smashed and the original cut away?
Taking all the information together which we have, there's no doubt about it. It must have been the sack of Rome.
Paul concluded it was the Manopello image that was torn from this smashed frame. The image even has a glass chip still embedded in it.
The whole story of this frame is giving even more credence to the theory of Professor Pfeiffer and Paul Bade that the true Veronica of the Middle Ages is a Manopello today.
It is a conflict about plausibility. If somebody comes up with a theory which is more plausible, I'm the first one to applaud it, the first one.
For Paul, the evidence linking the Manopello image to the original Veronica was conclusive. He was certain that they are one and the same. This now begged the biggest question of all. Could this really be the face of God? And if so, how had it been created? Paul went back to the original story and looked for clues. The problem is, Saint Veronica doesn't exist in the Bible.
One of the striking features of the Western version of the legend is the character of Veronica herself, a saint kind of created by clerical error, if you like. The name obviously derives from the Latin for the true icon, or Latin and Greek. The true image of Christ becomes the Vera Icone Veronica. You've invented a saint.
In other words, there never was a Veronica. Her name simply referred to the cloth itself.
The legend of Veronica was only one of many attempts to explain what we really have. But the name is revealing what we are talking about. Vera Iconia, the true image, was not the name of a woman, but the name of the image.
The implications of this are enormous. If Veronica did not exist, then the image could not have been created when she had wiped Jesus' face on the way to the crucifixion. So how did it get there? Paul examined the material itself and discovered how extraordinarily fine it was. It didn't look like linen or even silk. But what could it be? Researching on the internet, he came across an ancient fabric called byssus.
There are several types of byssus in antiquity, but the most precious one was created from the silk of a shell of a mussel. It's called Pinna nobilis. It's a very large Mediterranean mussel, 90 centimeters. Large thing.
Divers harvested byssus by hand. It took thousands of threads to make the smallest piece of silk. And as a result, it was extremely valuable. Byssus was so precious, it had long been revered as a religious material. Critically, it was used during the time of Christ.
It was the most precious fabric in the antique times. You find it in the graves of the pharaohs in Egypt. You find it in the cloth of the high priest, the ephod made of byssus. In the curtain of the temple, byssus was mentioned. It's mostly translated in English, for instance, shining linen.
But was the Manapello image made of byssus? Continuing his research, Paul tracked down a woman in Sardinia, the last mussel silk cultivator. He flew her to Manapello to see the image for herself.
We brought her here to the image of the veil. She got on her knees. She said, oh dear, that's byssus. That's mussel silk.
Byssus was far too valuable to have been used as something to mop up sweat. So how might the image have got there? Paul went back to the Bible to look for clues. After Jesus died, he was taken down from the cross and laid in the tomb with the different cloths needed for his burial. A shroud to wrap the body and a veil to cover his face.
Everybody was expecting to do the final burial on Sunday morning. That's why the women returned to wash and clean and embalm the body. When they came, the body had disappeared. The tomb was empty. He was not there anymore, because he was not dead anymore. He had risen.
In John chapter 20, there's that wonderful description of Peter and John running to the empty tomb. They've just heard from the women that Jesus is no longer in the tomb, and they go and investigate. The Gospels are very clear that when the disciples entered the empty tomb, there were various burial cloths lying around, not just the shroud, but amongst others, the cloth that was around the face of Christ.
Such a funeral veil would have been made of a fine, valuable material like byssus. Could it have been that whilst wrapped around Jesus' head, it had miraculously taken on the image of his face?
The Church clearly believes in the supernatural. It clearly believes in the miraculous. It clearly believes that the divine can work in the world. So it's certainly open to the possibility of images made without human hands. It was the image of a Christ who is alive, rather than the image that we find on the Shroud of Turin, the image of a dead man.
For the early Christians, it must have been a revelation that not only the body of the suffering Christ was imprinted on the burial cloth, but we also have the face of the resurrected Christ on a veil. And of course, both relics were venerated and given from generation to generation.
So could the Manopello image have been made by a miraculous process? Skeptics have often claimed that the Manopello image must just be a painting. But Paul discovered byssus has an unusual quality. You cannot dye or paint on it.
Paul Bade verified it is indeed not ordinary silk, but shell silk which you cannot paint. There are some very small pigments by medieval painters who try to refresh or to intensify colors in some points, or maybe even try to put fur images against it to get the replica blessed by the original. We call it second-class relic or relic by touch. But Paul Bade verified it is not a human being.
For Paul, all the pieces supporting his belief in the truth behind the Manopello image were fitting into place. From the Bible, he believed he had deduced what the cloth itself was used for.
Rather than being the cloth used by that pious woman as Jesus carried the cross, that it was actually one of the burial cloths of our Lord.
From paintings, he saw how the same image had been revered in Rome throughout the Middle Ages.
If you compare the Volto Santo of Manopello with all the paintings we have of the Veronica in Rome, they are identical. They're identical even in details.
And from the broken frame, he could see how it had been saved after the sacking of Rome and sent to Manopello, where it had been quietly forgotten for nearly 500 years.
It's so evident. This is the veil. There's no doubt about it. I mean, you could rip my skin off. I mean, this is it.
For Paul Bade, the story of Manopello's face of God was almost complete, and he could start writing up his theory. After completing his research, he sent all his evidence along with photographs to Pope John Paul II. It had been an incredible journey.
I couldn't believe it, but the whole story. Every time and again, I had to pinch myself because it's a miraculous story.
Paul's work found a wide audience. Not only was it seen by Pope John Paul, but also by Cardinal Ratzinger, the leading authority on Catholic doctrine and thought, who complimented Paul on his work. And then, out of the blue on Sunday the 13th of March 2005, Paul Bade was granted an extraordinary opportunity to see the version of the Veronica in the Vatican. Making his way into St. Peter's, he was aware that this could be the final piece of the puzzle.
I don't know how come that I have seen it, that all of a sudden the doors opened, I could enter the column.
Within the Veronica column is a staircase leading to a small chapel housing the actual image itself.
Of course, Paul Bade has seen what they believe to be the Veronica in the Vatican right now and had the opportunity to see this relic from close by.
In the depths of the Veronica column, he finally saw the Veil of Veronica. But it was a dark, unrecognizable image, nothing like the old artist's reproductions, and it was housed in a heavy, ornate picture frame. Clearly, this was a completely different image.
What I saw there, I saw a big silver frame. You see this hoax, as I might call it, or copy. Everything had disappeared.
He was even denied permission to photograph it. The Vatican have taken their own photos, but they are rarely shown.
The reason why they don't publish these pictures is they don't want to disappoint the faithful by revealing that there is no face on the Veronica anymore.
To this day, no pope has openly admitted that the Vatican Veronica ever disappeared, or that the barely visible face shown today is anything other than what had always been on display. But Paul had no doubt about what had really happened.
It was a trick. It was a trick from the 500 years ago, from these times of Machiavelli.
Paul is certain that this trick or hoax was deliberately perpetrated to maintain the illusion that the Vatican still had the real one. But if this had happened hundreds of years ago, why not admit it now?
I think there's no question that having the Veronica in your church, if you happen to be the Pope, would be an incredibly useful asset. You know, it's an item of incredible holiness and power. Everyone is awestruck by it. You're going to get a lot of people coming to see it, and it shores up your power, effectively, as leader of the church.
Confessing that this face has gone lost, it was a hard thing to do.
For Rome and her powerful popes, such a monumental loss of face would have been deeply embarrassing.
It's a catastrophe for the Church of Rome. We lost the face of God. Not the faith in God, but the face of God.
Paul thought there may have been another reason why the hoax was perpetrated. The Veronica had earned the church a lot of money.
They did not come to see St. Peter. They did not even come to see the Pope, as they do today. They wanted to see the veil.
Pilgrims had to be shown something, and that's just what happened. What started as a small hoax was simply allowed to continue until it became widely believed.
It's easy to dismiss it as just a cynical cashing-in exercise, and I'm sure it was partly a cynical cashing-in exercise. But it was also a way of making that pilgrimage real. I mean, remember, the whole idea of pilgrimage, at least in theory, is to take part in the physicality of something holy.
But others are more sympathetic about why the Veronica might have been replaced.
First of all, I have to disagree with both Father Pfeiffer and my dear friend Paul Bade in the idea that the canons of St. Peter perpetrated a hoax, a pious forgery, a pious fraud. I do not believe it. I believe they were hysterically searching for something and just took the second best and believed it because they wanted to believe it, that this is the right Veronica.
On April the 2nd, 2005, Pope John Paul II died. He was succeeded by the man who had complimented Paul on his book, Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI.
On the 1st of September 2006, Pope Benedict visited Manopello. Often he visited Italian shrines to venerate the relics or the local traditions. And there's that very evocative image of Pope Benedict just staring at the veil in Manopello. There's a real sense of an encounter, of encountering face to face with Christ. He was clearly very moved.
For Paul, this was the justification for all his hard work.
When he came to Manopello for the first Pope, Then he prayed here in silence. He bowed, he bent his knee in front of it. And then for more than 8 minutes, he's been in silent prayer in front of it. I mean, it was very, very moving.
It was the first time, for we believe around 500 years, that the Pope saw and venerated the true face of Christ, of the resurrected Christ.
Pope Benedict's visit changed everything.
A week later, on St. Peter's Square, in the next audience, he said, if we want to know who God is, then we only have to look into the face of his Son, and there we see who God is and how God is.
Although not actually authenticating the image, Pope Benedict's personal visit gave credibility to those that believed this was the true face of God.
He brought the image back into the world. That's what he did.
Paul and many of the faithful believe there is no doubting that this image is genuine. But there will always be skeptics. They want proper scientific evidence to show how the image got there and how old it is. The guardians at Manopello aren't against testing, as long as it is non-invasive and so doesn't damage the veil. They hope science will develop in the future, allowing for a more detailed examination which they are sure will vindicate their claims. If this happens, then the Veil of Veronica would become one of the most significant discoveries in Christian history.
Just as the Veronica was a very popular relic in the Middle Ages, we're now entering a new period, a revival of this interest in the Holy Face, searching for the face of God, searching for that personal encounter with him.
St. Paul wrote in his letters, if Christ did not resurrect, our faith is worthless. So the veneration of the Volto Santo is concentrating the attention of Christianity back onto the image of the resurrected Christ. And that's important.
The Garden of Eden, the biblical birthplace of all humanity.
The story is one way of showing how the human world came to be as we know it.
But is it just a story? Or did Eden really exist?
Every culture has a story that says this is how we came to be, this is what happened.
One maverick scientist was desperate to know the truth.
Why did they tell that story? Where did it come from? And what's behind it?
He risked everything to find the answer.
I would have expected backlash. There are people who don't believe it now.
This is the story of one man's quest for the Garden of Eden.
My rule is, if people think it's crazy, it's probably right.
In 1987, a respected magazine published an article about the work of a little-known archaeologist named Joris Zarins. In it, Zarins claimed to know the earthly location of paradise, the Garden of Eden. Zarins' work caused a storm. Many religious people felt it was sacrilege to apply scientific principles to the Word of God. It should be accepted on faith or not at all.
I would have expected backlash. There are people who don't believe it now. It's like anything else. I don't believe that, I don't want to know that, that's different, that's uncomfortable.
Some respected academics were also deeply skeptical. They thought Zarins was just wasting his time. Many biblical scholars thought the story was just an allegory, with no basis in fact.
Certainly by the 19th century, most educated people no longer think the story of the Garden of Eden is a literal account of the beginning of humanity and the fall of mankind.
But Zarins did not care about other people's opinions.
Most people are not interested in trying to think through. Let's put it this way. If I said to you, I'm going to research the Garden of Eden based upon the Genesis story, people are going to go, well, why?
Surprisingly, this was not a religious quest, nor was it a hunt for buried treasure or precious relics. It was a journey motivated purely by a thirst for knowledge. Zarins wanted to know about the origins of human society. And despite the fact he is a committed atheist, he thought that the answers lay in, of all places, a biblical legend.
A faith person will say, yeah, that happened, and I believe it, that's the end of it, okay? But a scientific person says, well, why did they tell that story? Where did it come from, and what's behind it? And then you start, like a detective, you start looking at it.
Zarins' archaeological career had a promising start. But despite his keen intellect, many people found working with him a challenge.
He's nuts. If someone has spoken with Yuri, they understand. He's brilliant. The man is brilliant beyond words. But he is a little bit hard to follow. Intellectually, yes, he is truly one of the most intelligent human beings I've ever met. Socially, he's 5. But
perhaps because of his unorthodox style, finding an environment he could work in wasn't easy. But he secured a place at a small college in the heart of the American Midwest called Missouri State University.
I had to find a job, and you just don't get a job at just any old place. Particularly archaeology. Archaeological jobs are hard to come by in academic circles, so you take one where you can get it.
But rather than hinder his career, Zarins found his work at Missouri State helped him become something of a rising star.
this guy did things that the news media covers. I mean, he made Smithsonian, Nat Geo, worked on projects that were, had huge budgets. So he brought press and money through the school, which is always good for the school. He was very much encouraged to do his own thing.
The freedom Zarins had at Missouri State meant he could pick and choose his own passions to follow. So he spent most of his time indulging his greatest passion. The vast deserts of Arabia.
The reason I love it is because it's so austere. It makes you come to grips with yourself. You have to learn about yourself. You have to learn about others and trust others, but you have to learn how to survive and how to suffer. I like that.
Arabia was also rich terrain for an up-and-coming archaeologist making a name for himself. Unlike the well-trodden sites of the ancient classical world of the Mediterranean or Egypt, Arabia was undiscovered country.
Arabia was a cultural landscape that was like a desert, literally, because archaeologists hadn't been allowed in. The tribes are too dangerous in most places in Arabia. It's so remote, many places are so remote. Believe it or not, I'm the first person sometimes to touch something that's 500,000 years old.
Zarins also developed a reputation as something of a maverick. He refused to follow the traditional academic career path and started taking, in effect, freelance commissions. He would work with pretty much anyone who had an idea he liked the sound of.
Works the same no matter who's paying for it, isn't it? Who cares?
These nonconformist methods led him to a project in Oman related to, of all things, a Bible story. The legend of the 3 kings bearing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
Our real project was to find out and figure out the frankincense trade.
Zarins and his team set off into the vast Arabian desert. They wanted to know how long people had been trading frankincense and how it came to be such a valuable commodity across the ancient world.
Frankincense only grows a couple places in the world, and it originates in that Oman, Yemen region. We went on to study basically the trade routes, where it would have come from, how they would have transported it, what they were doing with it.
Zarins, Owen, and their colleagues worked in Oman's so-called empty quarter for more than 4 years, looking for evidence of trade routes stretching as far as India, Egypt, and Rome. And after an extensive search, they made an extraordinary discovery, a lost city called Ubar. Legends of Ubar can be found in the book of 1001 Arabian Nights, where it is described as a place of fantastic wealth and lush greenery in the desert. According to the Quran, it was supposedly destroyed by God as a punishment for its misbehaving king. Indeed, until Zarins found it, no one was even sure if Ubar really existed.
So we found this location, this oasis in the center of southern Oman, and we found out that this was the jumping off place where they were congregating and sending caravans. Hundreds of animals were being transported in this direction, and they were using frankincense, among other things, to trade.
And those trade caravans we know moved for centuries.
Zarins discovered that frankincense had been traded across the region for at least 8,000 years. From Ubar, frankincense caravans would have set off in all directions, including, of course, to the Holy Land. Along with goods to sell, these caravans would have carried something else: stories, including many that eventually found their way into the Bible. Zarins realized its authors borrowed some of their material from other cultures.
It's called plagiarism. They plagiarized it, stole it, and repackaged it. The Hebrew Bible repackaged the story that's much older and came from its proper location where people lived and experienced it.
Zarins began to wonder about the origins of one story in particular, the tale of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. He wondered whether it was one of the stories that had been borrowed from another culture. Of all the many fables in the Bible, this one seemed to be based on real events.
When people wrote something down, they're not lying to you. It's not baloney. It's just that they don't think you need scientific evidence.
Zarins was convinced that the ancient Hebrew people who wrote the Bible could not have possibly created this legend on their own. So where did it come from originally? Zarins decided to find out. His quest for the Garden of Eden had begun. His first clue came from the very word, Eden. How this word came to be in the Bible has always been something of a mystery, because it is not native to Hebrew, the original language of the Old Testament.
Eden doesn't translate literally with a Hebrew translation or any kind of Semitic translation. It's not a word that's particular to the language of the story that we're familiar with. They knew the story from somewhere else because they incorporated some of that language.
Where did the ancient Hebrews first hear this word? Zarins knew it came from an area about 800 miles to the east of the Holy Land, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. He also knew it dated back to the world's oldest known civilization, the first people to create an organized urban society, the Sumerians.
The Sumerians would be the earliest groups of people who settled and began to cultivate the land in the area of the Tigris-Euphrates. Sumer is the first really organized group of agricultural city-states, and they began to develop a network of interaction through their crops and their trade and using the rivers.
It was these ancient people who first used the word Eden.
It's a very, very ancient word, which the Sumerians used in a very ancient way, and it means a land of steppes or grasslands where people live kind of wild, where animals are wild.
The Sumerians used the term Eden to refer to uncultivated areas beyond their territory. In other words, the sort of place where nature was not controlled by man, but by God. If this word, Eden, came from Mesopotamia, then it seemed logical that the Garden of Eden was located there. This idea was supported by the fact that many early Bible stories have Mesopotamian roots.
If you look at the history of the biblical people, if you look at an Abraham, a biblical Abraham, he came from somewhere in that region.
For example, most people don't know that Sumer's mentioned in Genesis is called Shinar. The Tower of Babel, these are all Sumerian stories.
In fact, the first 12 chapters of the book of Genesis, up to the point where Abraham departs for Egypt, takes place in Mesopotamia.
Everything in those stories is from Mesopotamia. If you don't believe me, read it.
In the 1980s, Zarens's curiosity piqued, and he formally took up the quest that he had been informally pursuing for years. He started a study group to test out the idea that the Garden of Eden was a real place and discover where that place was. If he couldn't convince his own students his ideas were right, he wouldn't be able to convince anyone.
We met in his office, because there were like 5 of us. We talked about some of these things. It made a lot of sense to him, and it didn't take him long to talk us into seeing the logic of it. And at that point, he was still our professor. He wasn't somebody I'd spent 20 years working with. He was my professor. So clearly he knew something.
Zarens's starting point was the Bible itself, and its first, oldest part, the book of Genesis.
Well, I should perhaps explain that the Bible has 2 accounts of creation. The Garden of Eden story is the second one, and probably the earlier one.
The story begins when God plants a garden eastward in Eden. There, he made every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. And of course, in the middle of the garden, he put the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
The story is one way of showing how the human world came to be as we know it, or as the Israelites knew it. And there was a kind of a test in the garden. There are these 2 trees, the tree of life, which the first humans are not barred from eating from, which gives immortality, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which gives some kind of wisdom.
As every Sunday school student knows, one day, a serpent tempts Eve into eating the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge.
So she eats of the tree of knowledge and gives some to her husband, Adam, who meekly follows.
As punishment, God casts Adam and Eve out of the garden. And later destroyed Eden along with the rest of the earth in the great biblical flood. And yet, ever since that day, people have sought to find Eden, or at least evidence that it truly existed. The very text of the Bible actually provides some tantalizing clues about Eden's possible location.
Genesis 2-3, the famous story, has some verses in verses 10 to 14 where a river is said to come out of the Garden of Eden, and it becomes 4 headwaters. And the rivers in question are Tigris and Euphrates, and we all know where they are. They're the major rivers of Mesopotamia, the modern Iraq.
The other 2 rivers are called the Pishon and the Gihon. Unlike the Tigris and the Euphrates, which still flow today, no one knew where these other 2 rivers once ran, or if they ever really existed. It appears these 2 rivers have always been quite obscure, even in biblical times. In fact, the first known mention of them is the Bible itself.
Quite a bit more is said about those 2 rivers in the text, which probably implies that to the ancient Hebrews too, though those rivers were a bit more unknown and mysterious, so required a bit of elaboration.
The Pishon is said to encompass a mineral-rich land called Havilah, and the Gihon is said to flow through a land called Cush. Some versions of the Bible translate Cush as Ethiopia. Locating these two rivers and where they joined with the Tigris and Euphrates to form the famous four headwaters was the key to unlocking the mystery of Eden's position. Find the rivers, and Zarins would find Eden.
What happens is it just says there were four rivers, and they made one river, and that's where the garden is. I mean, if everybody knew where the four rivers was, the biblical scholars would have solved this question years ago.
The location of the Pishon and the Gihon has baffled scholars for centuries. Many medieval thinkers thought the Pishon might be the river Ganges, India's holiest river. As for the Gihon, even today, most biblical scholars believe that it refers to the river Nile.
Now, the text says, the river Gihon flows around the whole land of Cush. And Cush, everywhere else in the Old Testament, means Nubia or the Sudan. And Jewish tradition was very strongly convinced of that over many centuries. It didn't deviate. And the fact that it goes all the way around the land of Cush, which is the name for Sudan, south of Egypt, the Nile is the only important river there.
But that interpretation presented a serious problem. The Nile isn't anywhere near the Tigris or the Euphrates. So there is no place on Earth where it could join with them and the Pishon to form the all-important four headwaters, the location of the Garden of Eden.
The ancient Israelites' knowledge of distant geography wasn't perfect. Their geography is a bit confused because we know the Nile doesn't really join up anywhere near the Tigris-Euphrates.
If the authors of the Bible made such fundamental errors like connecting the Nile to the Euphrates, how could they be trusted about anything else? The Garden of Eden could be literally anywhere. For hundreds of years, scholars have faced this exact problem, and some of them found a very inventive solution. They put the Garden of Eden wherever they wanted.
Well, a president of Boston University, no less, in the 19th century called William Warren, who located the Garden of Eden at the North Pole. Mormons locate the Garden of Eden in Jackson County, Missouri, in the United States. Columbus thought he'd found it by the Orinoco River in Venezuela. There were some who wanted to locate it in China. Well, if you think the Garden was in the East, well, put it in the Far East.
But for Zarins, the Bible's incoherent geography left him at a dead end. If he tried to follow its directions to Eden, he would be lost wandering in the wilderness forever. It was the same fate that had befallen every Eden seeker of the past. But Zarins found a way around the impasse. His solution was to abandon his Bible studies and turn instead to a more traditional academic discipline: history. Zarins knew that the word Eden had come from the world's first civilization, the Sumerians. Sumer also happens to be the one place where two of the four biblical rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, touch. This offered Zarins and his group another avenue to explore. The Sumerians were the world's first people to use writing, and by recording their thoughts for posterity, they quite literally invented history.
They created writing in order to make sure who got what came from who did it, who paid taxes and who didn't. So somebody didn't say, I paid, I didn't pay. Oh, I can't remember. Did I pay, did I not pay? Now they're writing it down and go, no, it says here you didn't, right?
Although writing was invented as a means of bookkeeping, the Sumerians quickly found it was a useful tool for recording other ideas.
Later on, they got around to writing down things like people were sitting around thinking great thoughts and wrote down their stories. Yeah.
One of those stories was of particular importance to the Eden Project, a tale that quite possibly is the world's oldest written story.
Every culture, be it a literate culture or a non-literate culture, has a creation story, has a story that says this is how we came to be, this is what happened. And if you look at that root story, the oldest written version of a creation story comes to us from the Sumerians.
The story the Sumerians wrote is known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it has some shocking similarities to the story of Eden. Similarities which would help guide Zarins on his quest.
Gilgamesh was a king of Uruk in Mesopotamia who was 2/3 god and 1/3 man. And that was his problem. Because he was only 2/3 god, he was not immortal, but destined to die like those of us who are 3/3 human. He became overwhelmed with a sense of his own human mortality, so he wanted to find the secret of immortality.
In his search for the secret of immortality, Gilgamesh meets various characters who explain to him how humans came to be.
The Sumerians talk about man being created from clay, which makes sense. They're a river culture, so what is the substance that's most useful and most abundant? It's clay.
Men were created out of clay, okay? And as they were created out of clay, then they said, well, now wait a minute, we got to get women in here somehow, so then we get women made out of men. And then we put them in a place where people live forever, where it was really nice, and nobody got sick. People lived at the bequest of God. You know, that's that kind of story.
When compared to the story of Eden, this earlier creation story has a distinctly familiar ring. Adam, too, was created out of clay, and Eve was created out of Adam's body. And the Sumerian idea of a land where there is no unhappiness, illness, or death has an obvious parallel to the Garden of Eden itself. The one difference is that the Sumerians did not call their version of paradise Eden. They called it Dilmun.
Dilmun refers to a place. It's a specific place. It's a settled paradise. It's an abundance. All blessings of nature sort of come together. It's a way to live without worry.
The similarities are uncanny, even down to the way both Dilmun and Eden are eventually destroyed in a great flood.
So man is created from clay to serve the gods. In serving the gods, man becomes annoying to the gods. And the gods say, oh, we need to make this go away. And they make it rain. So there's a flood story. Someone is saved, and they go on to then repopulate the earth.
In the Sumerian version of the story, the man who was saved and repopulates the earth is not called Noah. His name is Utnapishtim. And in return for saving humanity, one remorseful god grants him the gift of eternal life.
Gilgamesh is looking at this and saying, well, how do I get eternal life? So he's going to go searching for it.
Gilgamesh, the Sumerian god king, seeks out Utnapishtim, hoping the old man will reveal the secret of living forever. When they meet, Utnapishtim realizes that Gilgamesh is a hero, worthy of immortality, and tells him how to achieve it.
Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that the secret of immortality is for him to find the plant of life and to eat from this.
He also tells Gilgamesh that the plant will be underwater, in the place where paradise once stood, the land of Dilmun.
This is a clue to scholars to say, well, where is he searching for this? And the answer is the land of Dilmun, which is the land of paradise.
After an epic journey, Gilgamesh reaches Dilmun. But just when he has immortality within his grasp, disaster strikes.
He finds this plant of life in the water, and he's just going to grasp it and consume it. But unfortunately for him, a serpent snatches it away first, and the serpent rejuvenates itself.
This tale of humankind being offered the chance of eternal life, only to have it snatched away, is of course exactly the same fate that befalls Adam and Eve.
There is a moral in this story that immortality is something just beyond a human's grasp. And there is a similar theme in the Garden of Eden story, that the human beings were originally not debarred from eating of the tree of life, but because they disobeyed God and ate of the tree of knowledge, they are cast out of the garden and lose the chance of eating of the tree of life, so in a sense are doomed from the chance of having an immortal existence in this life.
As far as Zarins was concerned, it was clear that the story of Eden was nothing more than a Hebrew interpretation of the Epic of Gilgamesh.
I would say it was the same thing, because Adam transgresses and Eve, and so they're punished by having mortality, and they have to work for a living.
When ancient Hebrews heard these Sumerian stories, Zarins believes they decided to make them their own and put them in the Bible.
The biblical story changed the Mesopotamian story, if you like. It monotheized it, so it's not simply taking over a pagan story. It's now only one God who brings the flood and delivers a flood hero. There's a proper reason for the flood. It's because of humans' sin.
Unfortunately, the story itself did not seem to offer any obvious clues to Eden's location. It seemed like yet another dead end. But there was one thing that offered Zarins a glimmer of hope. The name the Sumerians used for their version of paradise, Dilmun. If he couldn't find Eden, perhaps he could find Dilmun. Zarins was not the first person to make the connection between Eden and Dilmun. Ever since the Sumerian language was first decrypted, scholars have suggested that the two places might somehow be linked.
Dilmun is interesting because it's debated. It's supposed to be this idealized paradise, this special place that's very advanced, where civilization and culture thrive. It would be like in Atlantis. We have this mystery place where these incredible advances happen.
As far as anyone knew, Dilmun was just a myth, a parable that had no basis in fact. If that were true, then Eden too was never likely to have been a real place. Zarins, however, knew that Dilmun was not simply a figment of the imagination. It was a real place. In fact, he was one of the people who discovered it in the 1970s. Now, in the quest for Eden, Zarins found himself revisiting his earlier work.
Uri was in the field, going to all these places looking for evidence of early civilization, stone tools. So he was looking for these things, and I don't know if it sparked in his mind then or it sparked later as he came back and processed more and more of what he had seen. But it came together by the time I had began to study with him as a cohesive idea.
Zarins and his colleagues found evidence of a civilization, a string of trading centers that once thrived along the eastern shores of Arabia. Today, evidence of this culture can still be seen on the Arabian island of Bahrain.
When we began to work in Saudi Arabia, we helped discover that, and it's a very, very rich region.
This discovery came as something of a surprise, considering that today, the area is little more than a vast, empty desert.
It was a place where different people congregated. It was the ancient Hong Kong. People had good stuff coming in from everywhere.
Crucially, Zarins discovered that Sumerian traders had visited this land and recorded the name of it as Dilmun.
The Sumerian cities became actively interested in trade with any place that they could possibly trade with. So they're looking for raw materials. They bring raw materials back to Sumer, make nice things, sell them back to them at a profit. So they were in the Gulf. As soon as the Sumerians start writing, they write, bingo, Dilmun. So we know that.
But why would the Sumerians think of this run-of-the-mill trading center as a paradise? The answer may lie with the distance between Dilmun and Sumer. It could only be reached by sea, and even then, only the most intrepid sailors ever went there. Just like sailors throughout history, they brought home tall tales of this faraway land.
You know how sailors are. They love places that are far away. Sailors don't talk about home. They talk about distant places so they can impress people where they've been. They found this place in the Gulf with this beautiful water, and they start talking about it.
The Sumerian sailors told of a place that was not only rich and magnificent, but lush. Unlike the dry, hard scrabble land of Sumer, Dilmun was verdant and green.
It's exotic to the Sumerians, but not exotic to local people. So, you know, they just make a transference of what it was, how beautiful it was.
Over time, Sumerians came to think of Dilmun as a special place. So much so, they assumed it was the very place where humankind was first created. Zarins had started with a cryptic biblical legend. History in the form of the world's oldest story allowed him to link Eden to the Sumerian paradise of Dilmun. Archaeology had helped him discover that Dilmun was a real place. Yet still, the Dilmun that Zarins discovered was nothing more than a desert trading outpost. There seemed nothing to support the idea of it being green and beautiful. Another roadblock on the way to the Garden of Eden. To get past it, Zarins gave up on the idea of scouring the historical record and turned instead to hard science.
His undergraduate work was in geology, so he has a background in hard science as well, which is, again, what makes him interesting. Because of all of Uri's different talents, he brings it all together and then is, like I said, a much better storyteller because he can actually look at something both scientifically and as an anthropologist or archaeologist would.
The quest for Eden turned to the physical landscape of eastern Arabia and to the thorny question of the two missing rivers, the Gihon and the Pishon. If Zarins could not find them, then his whole quest would come to nothing.
We know the Tigris and Euphrates clearly are in Iraq at this point in time. And the question was, where would you get two other rivers that connect up with that? And that's where the science comes in.
There was no obvious way to break this impasse. Then, an answer came from the heavens. About the time that Zarins was in the thick of his quest, a revolutionary new technology came online. Satellite imagery. NASA had recently launched Landsat, a satellite designed to photograph the planet in its entirety for the first time. Today, this kind of imagery is commonplace, but in the 1980s, it was revolutionary.
You have to remember that in the late 80s, remote sensing was just beginning, and as a result of that, we're getting our first pictures, our first Landsat images were just beginning to pop up.
But simply getting hold of these images would be a challenging quest in itself. This was cutting-edge technology. A professor at an obscure Midwestern college chasing a legend was very much at the back of the queue.
Satellite images are really difficult to get a hold of because first they weren't that readily available. You have to beg people to produce this map for me.
Luckily, Zarins had a friend at NASA who snuck him some early low-resolution pictures. At last, Zarins was closing in on his goal. For the first time, he and his students could see the land of Dilmun in a way that had literally never been seen before.
It certainly changed things. If you're looking at an overview, if you're looking down on something like you would do with a Landsat photo, it's much more clear than if you're standing on the ground. So yes, it made a tremendous difference.
A careful study of the images revealed a shocking revelation. A river. Or more specifically, a dry channel snaking through eastern Saudi Arabia. It clearly marked where a river would once have flowed.
When you put the satellite image, you can just generally see it. You can like, this is it. And then you start drawing where the other rivers are. It really makes sense.
It was the breakthrough that Zarins had been seeking since his journey began. Now, as well as the Tigris and the Euphrates, he had found a third river, the Pishon.
The river originates in northwest Saudi Arabia. It's called the Arima, and it has multiple branches, and it comes down, comes around a little bit, then it starts swinging north, and now the Arabs call it the Wadi Button, belly button river. And it comes around, and it makes a huge delta by Kuwait. This would be the Pishon.
From the ground, this dry river channel, the Pishon, is all but impossible to see. It would appear as nothing more than a slight depression in the sand.
You would have no idea. You'd just be like, oh, more desert. You know, you couldn't picture it as lush and fertile.
But using detailed images obtained from Landsat's camera, this former river stood out clearly.
And then you look down and you're like, wait a minute, that's, oh. And that, at one time, this was all water.
When it was in full flow, the people of Dilmun would have had a perpetual water source, and there would have been plenty of food along the banks. It would have been a place of abundant life.
When you realize that a dried up riverbed was actually once a water source, that changes the whole lay of the land. And that's a eureka moment.
However, there was a problem. The river Zarins discovered clearly provided a source of water to the Sumerian version of Eden, Dilmun. But something was missing. The place where it connected to the Tigris and the Euphrates showed no evidence of ever being the beautiful, lush garden described in the Bible's story. And also, where was the fourth river, the Gihon? It looked like yet another dead end, but having come so far, Zarins wasn't about to give up. Reviewing all his evidence, Zarins had a revelation. He was looking for a place that existed thousands of years ago. So perhaps he should not simply look for where the biblical rivers flowed, but when. He quickly realized that the last time the Pishon had any water in it was 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age.
It was an Ice Age river. All of Arabia was drained by 3 huge rivers in the Ice Age. And gradually, in what we call the Neolithic period, they dried up and they weren't as extensive. So when they connected up, obviously the landscape was different. And so now you have to figure out when that was. The answer is about 5,000–6,000 BC.
This element of timing is important for 2 reasons. First, back when this river was still flowing, the region of the Persian Gulf looked quite different to how it does today. In fact, at that time, there was no Persian Gulf. It was dry land.
The Gulf is, during the last ice age, was completely dry land because sea level fell about 200 feet, and the deepest part of the Gulf is 120 feet. You'll figure it out. It's all dry.
If there was no water in the Persian Gulf, then the combined waters of the Tigris, Euphrates, and the Pishon must have continued flowing for many more miles beyond where they meet the sea today. They would have combined to form one great river, just as described in the Bible.
The rivers connect up ahead of what is today just south of or near Basra. That's where they would connect up. And now you can't see it because the Gulf's higher than what it is now.
But there was another, more important factor. 8,000 years ago, the climate of the region was totally different. At that time, monsoon rains, which today only reach the southernmost tip of Arabia, would have covered the whole peninsula with life-giving rain. It was this rain that fed the Pishon, allowing it to flow all year round. More importantly, the land around the river would not have been a harsh desert. It would have been lush and green. This is why the Sumerians thought of Dilmun as the birthplace of humanity, because it was a paradise.
The land of Eden. It would have been a steppe land with lots of little oases, marshlands, just like southern Iraq was to many people for a long time after that. It's a beautiful area. You got water, you got resources, you got mud, you can build houses, you got reeds, animals, plants, you got it all.
But although it would have undoubtedly been Eden-like, was this actually the Eden? Without the fourth river, the Gihon, it couldn't be. The Bible describes the Gihon as flowing through the land of Cush. For centuries, most scholars believed Cush referred to an area in East Africa. In fact, the King James Version of the Bible even uses the word Ethiopia. But Zarins knew there was a different interpretation. Cush could also be a reference to the area around the Zagros Mountains, located in modern-day Iran.
Then they said, oh, the Gihon, it comes out of the land of Cush. And they go, well, now, he was explaining to you that Cush is another word for Iran. See? You have to know that.
As it happens, there is a major river that still flows out of the Zagros Mountains, the land of Cush. Today, it is called the Karun.
The Karun River, which comes out of Iran, is still there, still carries water, comes out of the Zagros.
Until it was dammed in the 1970s, it too connected with the Tigris and the Euphrates, at the exact place where the newly discovered Pishon also joins. These rivers form the so-called four headwaters that flowed southward to form one great river. Zarins believed this was the location of the Garden of Eden. This last discovery was the final proof Zarins needed for his theory. Several times he was close to failure. It was only by combining his knowledge across so many disciplines that he was able to finally solve this ancient puzzle.
That's something that's a little bit unique to Yuri in that his background is diverse enough that he can put it together in a bigger picture, which is that creative aspect of being multidisciplinary. Because of all of Yuri's different talents, you know, he brings it all together and he's just a much better storyteller.
But like the maverick he is, Yuris Zarins refuses to take all the credit. He believes his breakthrough only came thanks to the work of others, across many different disciplines. All he did was put these pieces of the puzzle together.
You think that's where it is, and you draw satisfaction from saying that you pushed the ball forward a little bit because you added a lot more data and made people think about it, not just from reading the text.
This was not the end of the quest. Zarins refused to rest on his laurels. For him, the location of the garden was not the most important thing. He wanted to know how true the story in the Bible was and what it really meant. Putting together everything he had learned so far, it occurred to Zarins that the story was not really about how the first human beings were created. Instead, it was about how human society was created. The epoch-defining moment when we humans stopped being hunter-gatherers and started becoming farmers.
The Garden of Eden story is an explanation of how farming originated.
Zarins' theory rests on a radical notion, the idea that the Garden of Eden was not the only one of its kind. He believes that the whole region, the land known as Dilmun, was filled with Eden-like places.
Well, the garden no different than any oasis you see now in Arabia. Arabia, it's called an oasis because subterranean water fractures and everything turns green. Attracts plants, attracts humans, attracts animals. It's just a place where people congregate. So this was a kind of a marshy, green area that attracted animals, plants, and so on, and original people.
According to Zarins, the Garden of Eden was a home to prehistoric humans, hunter-gatherers who were able to survive purely from what they found growing naturally. But as the last ice age ended, the waters in the world's oceans began to rise. Eventually, this Garden of Paradise would have been drowned in the flood. In its place today, we find the Persian Gulf.
It flooded the area, and it flooded the Garden of Eden. It's flooded. It's underwater now. Can't see it.
The floods forced humans to move northwards into the much harsher landscape of Mesopotamia that we are familiar with today. There was no easy living here. If people wanted food, they had to grow it. They had to become farmers. And that meant using primitive technology to cultivate the land.
When people create inventions of some kind or another, whether it's taming nature or inventing metals or writing, you can never go back. You just can't reverse technological progress. And so it began with this idea of agriculture being one of the first ideas of change.
Zarins believes that the story of Eden was written as a lament for this extraordinary change and a yearning for the days of a simpler life. The advent of agriculture was not described as a great leap forward, but as a sin. Eve eating from the tree of knowledge.
What happened was they fell. They fell from grace. What is that? What does that mean? That means they transgressed against what God had provided. They knew better, and that's what we call the origin of agriculture. You know how to manipulate things now. You know how to make plants grow. You know how to create animals and get natural selection.
In 1987, the results of Zarins' work were published in Smithsonian Magazine.
Very satisfying to have that feeling that there's an answer, there's an explanation that is based in science as well as literature, that you can put these two things together and tell a story that is very identifiable. Oh, this is not so far off the mark. This works. This makes more sense than just poof, magic.
But once he put his ideas in the public sphere, Zarins discovered that many academics gave them short shrift.
Joris Zarin's views, I think, have multiple problems attached to them. The first is that the rivers Tigris and Euphrates flow down from the mountains of Armenia into the Persian Gulf area. Genesis 2 says the rivers flow out of Eden and become 4 headwaters. So that implies they are going from a higher area down to the Persian Gulf area. And so I think he's located the Garden of Eden at the wrong end. Even the ancient Hebrews knew that rivers don't flow upwards.
My rule is, if people think it's crazy, it's probably right. You know, academics being what they are, they wish they'd wrote it. They don't pay any attention to any of that.
But perhaps surprisingly, these theories were not so quickly rejected by people with a more religious disposition. In fact, many welcomed his work.
I would have expected, particularly here in the Bible Belt, Springfield is in the Bible Belt, I would have expected backlash. Uri spoke to more church groups, was invited to more public venues where you would have thought they would have been hostile to his ideas. And yet again, he's such a good storyteller. It's not offensive. He's in no way saying what you think is stupid. He's saying, here's a way to look at it scientifically and let your story be real. And he was welcomed in many cases with open arms. It was kind of fun to watch. I expected there to be more of a uproar.
The extraordinary insight of Joris Zarins showed that the legend of the Garden of Eden might be more than just a parable. It might be a true story, a story of how human society came to be.